History as it happens, July 18th, 2024. Traditions of violence.
Take a look at what happened.
Questions about the gunman, his possible motive, the Secret Service, and security at that rally.
20-year-old Thomas Matthew Crooks of Bethel Park, Pennsylvania.
And our hearts go out to the victims of this heinous act which occurred today.
This is the worst possible scenario. This is, as you said, political violence unfolding in front of us.
The near assassination of Donald Trump led to calls for Americans of all political persuasions to cool it, to bring down the temperature of their political rhetoric out of fear of more violence. Meantime, no one seems to know why the gunman wanted to shoot the former president in the first place. But he was not the first wannabe assassin with mysterious motives. That's next as we report history as it happens. Podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Some people on the Republican right have tried to see in it a conspiracy theory on the part of the left, this nebulous the left, conflating the Democrats with subversive left-wingers or whatever, or blaming, as Vance did, actually, blaming Biden, or saying it's the rhetoric about Trump that has inspired it. So there's been an attempt to politicize it and to use it as ammunition in the presidential race without any real knowledge of the motivation of the attempted assassin.
In an interview with NBC's Lester Holt, President Joe Biden was asked about the connection between language and political violence in light of the attempt by a 20-year-old in Pennsylvania to kill Donald Trump. Holt focused on Biden's use of the term bullseye on a call with supporters.
You called your opponent an existential threat on a call a week ago. You said it's time to put Trump in the bullseye. There's some dispute about the context, but I think you appreciate
I didn't say crosshairs. I was talking about focus on. Look, the truth of the matter was, what I guess I was talking about at the time was, there was very little focus on Trump's agenda.
Yeah, the term was bullseye.
It was a mistake to use the word. I didn't say crosshairs. I meant bullseye. I meant focus on him. Focus on what he's doing. Focus on his policies. Focus on the number of lies he told in the debate. There's a whole range of things that, look, I'm not the guy that said, I want to be a dictator on day one. I'm not the guy that refused to accept the outcome of the election.
So, in retrospect, what was a poor choice of words certainly was not a call to kill Donald Trump. But in the days since the attempted assassination, public discourse has come down to this kind of parsing of words and meanings. What sounds like a figure of speech to me, well, maybe someone else hears a call to action. And because in our internet age, every utterance can be preserved forever, social media feeds abound these days with clips of Donald Trump vaguely endorsing violence.
If she gets to pick her judges, nothing you can do, folks. Although the Second Amendment people, maybe there is, I don't know.
Or poking fun at victims of violence.
And we'll stand up to crazy Nancy Pelosi who ruined San Francisco. How's her husband doing, by the way? Anybody know?
Or seeming not to care when the January 6 rioters were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence."
No, you heard those chants. That was terrible. I mean,
He could have. Well, the people were very angry.
They're saying, "Hang Mike Pence."
Because it's common sense, John. It's common sense.
So simultaneous with calls to lower the temperature, each side is basically accusing the other of starting it. This is the second of two episodes this week about political violence, and in this conversation with Oxford Brookes historian Roger Griffin, we're going to delve deeper than surface layer partisanship, because political violence is often difficult to understand. Since Saturday, I've been thinking a lot about why Americans are so angry these days. The economy is pretty strong. We're not directly fighting any wars. Life for many people is pretty good. Well, this is superficial analysis. It hides a lot. No, we're not reliving the late Weimar Republic with mass unemployment, national humiliation and shame, and violent Nazi paramilitaries in the streets. But millions of Americans are disenchanted with our political institutions, which have failed them. They're unhappy with migration across the southern border. They haven't forgotten the damage done by the '08 crash or the opioid epidemic, deindustrialization for decades now. forever wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We're all familiar with this litany of maladies by now, but it is real. Also important, over the past decade, Americans have experienced a severe coarsening of public discourse and the destruction of basic civility and decency in politics. It's been said that Donald Trump brings out the worst in his supporters and his enemies. They accuse him of fascism, compare him to Hitler, among other hysterics. Division can lead to violence, yet political assassins have often acted out of non-political motives. Roger Griffin is an expert on socio-political movements, fascism, and terrorism. Welcome back to the show, Roger Griffin.
Thank you.
Joining us from Italy. Would you like to trade? Would you like to come to Washington and enjoy our 100% humidity so I can go to Italy for a little while? Or would you just...
In Italy, there's a particular weather condition called AFA, AFA, which is where you get humidity plus heat. And when it's afoso, it's pretty much like sitting in a greenhouse. So, but anything after the English non-summer, which has been a catastrophe, because the Americans sent the jet stream straight through the middle of the United Kingdom.
Oh, boy.
I think it's a Brexit punishment. I think Brussels has attracted the jet stream straight across England as punishment for leaving Europe.
So that's called ARFA, A-R-F-A.
AFA.
Okay,
Oggi AFA, yeah.
So I learn new words from you all the time. Palingenesis, incurvation, and now that one. Well, anyway, every time you come on, it's to discuss some deep and depressing issue. So we're going to talk about political violence, terrorism in this episode. Each act is unique. I was reviewing past assassinations of American presidents, attempted or successful. Not just presidents, but major political figures like Martin Luther King Jr., who was a civil rights leader. Each one is unique. Sometimes the motives are not what we might have assumed. For instance, John Hinckley shot Ronald Reagan because Hinckley was upset that Jodie Foster, the actress, was not interested in him. This case with Trump, this attempted assassination, the 20-year-old who fired the rifle at Trump, his politics are unknown. It's a mystery right now why he did this. However, would you agree that it almost doesn't matter, that because of the state of the country right now, this was looked at as an act of political violence that was motivated by the division in our society?
Well, it seems to me, and I'm trying to follow events from Italy, that it's been very interesting, the multiple responses to this event. I mean, predictably, some people on the Republican right have tried to see in it a conspiracy theory on the part of the left, this nebulous the left, conflating the Democrats with subversive left-wingers or whatever, or blaming, as Vance did, actually, blaming Biden, or saying it's the rhetoric about Trump that has inspired it. So there's been an attempt to politicize it and to use it as ammunition in the presidential race without any real knowledge of the motivation of the attempted assassin. Some people, Biden himself, have actually used it as a rallying cry to warn against political violence and to say that this is a warning about what happens when there's overheated rhetoric, and let's all calm down and let's take this as a warning about where things are going.
Or we may disagree. We are not enemies. We're neighbors. We're friends, co-workers, citizens, and most importantly, we're fellow Americans.
And then academics will come in and start using sophisticated ways of calibrating the degree of politics in it. I'd like to chuck in a name to throw around the dinner table sometime, a guy called Žižek, a famous Serbian English-speaking, English-writing political scientist who's a sort of enfant terrible of political science, because he basically writes a blend of political journalism with very interesting psychological and political insights. And in his half-readable, half-brilliant book called Violence, I find his terminology very unhelpful, but there we are. But he talks about subjective violence, where he talks about individuals acting out violent fantasies for their own purposes. And then he talks about objective violence, which is the violence meted out by movements. Now, I think that's very spurious, that distinction, because if you have a neo-Nazi killing a Turkish shopkeeper, even though he might be an individually motivated, psychologically motivated extremist, by identifying as a neo-Nazi, he's simultaneously part of what Zizek, if I understand him correctly, is calling objective. And I don't think subjective object is very helpful. But what I do think is helpful, which is where all these distinctions get very nebulous, is to actually start realizing that certain types of violence which seem to have a political motive shade into, at a level of psychological dynamic, into the same sort of violence that you get against famous people, like the assassination of John Lennon, where somebody actually had a sort of obsession with John Lennon, and in a way which anticipated the Eminem song. It was a fan who killed John Lennon, which is a curious piece of psychology. But also the way you get explosions of violence which are purely those of frustration. If you take the violence of the riots in various parts of American and European history, Zizek is very interested in that, because he says even when a part of New York or Los Angeles suddenly unleashes violence, he calls it phatic violence, P-H-A-T-I-C, and that's like the word emphatic. And it's just an expression of something, and it's not just an expression of individual personal psychology, it's an expression of a sociological phenomenon of a category frustration, the frustration of poor blacks, or in the case of France a few years ago, where the banlieue, the suburbs of Paris, became the source of massive violence. Now, that's in fact the event that sparked Zizek's book. The burning of cars in Paris was not ideological violence. It wasn't part of a movement, but it was definitely more than some sort of personal psychology or psychosis. It was definitely the expression of socio and therefore political frustration. So I think it's useful to start thinking about violence as, on the one hand, created by, in some cases, by deeply personal, if you like, states of extreme state of consciousness, but others as having overtly or subvertly political and social agendas.
Yeah, many of the presidential assassins, failed or successful in American history, had no political motive or discernible ideology, or were not part of an ideological or political crusade. They were acting out of, as you say, some type of personal problem. But it is still political violence, right? It's how it lands, how this is being interpreted, what just happened to Donald Trump. It has an effect on society. Even if we never figure out why this kid did it, he doesn't look like he was part of any type of political crusade. We may never know the motive, but it's how we respond to it. It seems like it is the result of where my society has been careening for quite a while. And we've discussed this on the show. We don't call Trump a fascist or a Hitler or any of this type of thing, right? But for a long time, people, Democrats, liberals, whoever, have been saying he's tantamount to Hitler, Republicans are fascists, they're going to destroy democracy as we know it. So that kind of hyperbolic talk, right, can lead people to do crazy things. Because if you really think this is it for our country, you might be motivated to do something to stop it. That wasn't a question, Roger, but go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the problem with this subjective objective and the fact that you can have political assassinations by people who are not part of any movement really underlines the problem of talking about political violence. If somebody chooses a major political figure, it could be because that person has somehow crystallized a very deep sense of frustration and anger and impotence in that person, and they are going for the highest visible target. I mean, let's take an extreme example. The Stauffenberg attempt on Hitler in 1944. Here were some conspirators who made very deep, they were conservatives, by the way, not on the left, and they made the decision amongst themselves very courageously to save Germany from being destroyed by Hitler by assassinating him. So that is very clearly a political assassination with an ideological and idealistic drive. Or if you take the storming of the Bastille, it already gets more complicated, because the storming of the Bastille was a symbol of the Ancien regime. It was the prison of Louis XVI, of all these people inside. And it was a symbol of everything that was hateful about what we would now call an autocratic regime. So that was politically motivated. So was the political violence of the terror, when people were being guillotined because of a very curious liberal ideology that the revolution had to be saved from these people who were undermining, from subversives. But even in those last two examples, you can see how what, on the one hand, looks like a political use of violence shades into some sort of, well, on the case of the Bastille, very deep social frustration, what Zizek calls phatic violence, where you have people, a mob, you have a sort of mob protest against a symbol of power, and it takes on a dimension of its own, which you could even say there are elements in the Capitol invasion in January 3 years ago. There was an element in the Capitol riot which was a sort of phatic expression of massive frustration and anger about the outcome of it wasn't pure, you can't put a political label on it. It was obviously pro-Trump, but it had a dimension to it where it was clearly a political event. The Capitol was a symbol of American establishment power.
What needs to happen today is Vice President Pence needs to not open the 7 state electors' envelopes for the states that I mentioned. Set them aside and send it all back to those state legislatures.
Well, we got to stop this steal from happening, because if we don't, nobody's ever going to vote again. There's not going to be any integrity in our voting system.
But nevertheless, if you go down to the level of individual personality and psychology, some of the people within there were there out of a much deeper and inarticulate sense of frustration and anger and a sense of betrayal.
This is our capital!
So once we start trying to categorize, this is what we call in academics a taxonomic problem. Once we start trying to allocate different types of political violence to different types of violence, then we get into all sorts of troubles. What I do think is more important and more fruitful is to talk about the degree to which the degeneration of political discourse in America has gone from, I am rather pleased with the fact that in the British election within the last couple of weeks, there has been a democratic transition of power. This is one of the fundamental principles of liberal democracy, that the Sunak leadership, the Conservative Party after 15 years, the rhetoric was very petty sometimes, it's very emotional, but nobody got killed, nobody was shot, nobody said it was illegitimate, and actually people afterwards, apart from Truss, who is a very good example of somebody who has taken it with bad grace, most of the people who left power in the Conservative Party took it as the decision of the people in a democratic sense. So that's what should happen in an electoral process. And what worries observers of America and many liberal Americans, and I use liberal in the European sense, people committed to an Enlightenment rational idea about how it's possible for a country not run by an autocrat, by a god, by an emperor, to actually somehow deal with power and deal with the exercise of power and the transition of power without resorting to physical or political violence or persecution or bullying of any kind. Now, what worries observers is that in the last 10 years, I would say, the last election that seemed to me fairly normal was the Barack Obama election as an outsider. But even by the time it was Hillary versus Trump, you've got the beginnings of this breakdown of a liberal language. And now we've got a real evidence of what is called technically in the political sciences Manichaeanization, this lovely word, Manichaeanization, a worldview where you are either with us or against us. You're either in the state or against the state.
Never give your opponent 1 ounce or inch of credibility.
Not just credibility, but humanity. Yeah. They become demonized, they become less than human, they become evil. Their lives don't matter as much as our lives. You get them and us. And when language starts getting like that, and when you start getting conspiracy theories about both sides, then you get a situation where a few symbolic deaths or gaffes or misspeakings, or even in a debate, can actually have extraordinary. I mean, we had a British BBC reporter who was at the most recent appearance of Trump, who said this was no longer politics, this was messianic. The atmosphere was one of the ones I'm familiar with are from fascism, Mussolini, Hitler, not because Trump is in any way like these people, but when you get a crowd or a reaction which goes way beyond simple, rational, humanistic relief and becomes almost that of a religious zealotry, a zealotry which, like Barabbas in the New Testament, is baying for the blood of somebody and not just celebrating somebody's survival, then yes, this is a very dangerous climate, which can either push people into pausing for a moment and say, this has gone too far, we must all calm down a bit, or could actually lead to some terrifying scenario where violence becomes normalized and where you get a series of protests, counter-protests, police getting in there, and you could end up in something like the breakdown of democracy that you had in May 68 in Paris, or even worse.
We've already had plenty of incidents in recent years, or close calls. Brett Kavanaugh of the U.S. Supreme Court. Someone was trying to harm or kill him, was arrested near his home. Paul Pelosi, the husband of former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, was nearly killed. Steve Scalise, a Republican congressman, was shot at a practice for a congressional baseball or softball game a few years ago. Gabby Gifford was shot, a Democratic congresswoman from Arizona. I mean, the list is long. And January 6th, and the Black Lives Matter protests in some cities turned into riots that lasted for days. So we've had a lot of problems with this. This is not anomalous, would you say, in American politics? We like to think that it is, but we have a tradition of violence in our country.
If you place American history in a much broader context, then one of the things that stands out is, of course, that America was created on the back of a genocidal destruction of an indigenous culture, on the top of an inheritance from the British and the French of slavery. Now, slavery is interesting because we talk about political violence, but people tend to think of violence in terms of physical aggression and harming. But of course, a system can be violent. One of the positive things that's happened with the word violent in my lifetime is that in terms of domestic violence, which used to be thought of as hitting women generally, it's now recognized as things called psychological violence, forms of aggression to do with control, which is a non-physical form of violence, which has its own terrible consequences on human life. So whatever the American myth is about having a divine mission, etc., it's based on one form of genocidal violence and another form of control violence. And it created itself out of a civil war, use of violence against an occupying power, as it was seen British, and has continued through with an American Civil War, which was based on a fundamental political disagreement about the ideology of slavery. And so there are major episodes of violence in American history at the foundational level and in the 19th century, which carry through into, I would say, the perpetuation of racism in America right into the post-war period, even as a sort of institutionalized situation, is also a form of violence. And
Jim Crow is what you're referring to, Jim Crow, yeah.
Yeah, I'm talking to Jim Crow, but even after Jim Crow, I mean, you know, the experience of black Vietnamese recruits in Vietnam, not only fighting this war in Vietnam, but also still suffering racism from their white military colleagues, etc. So but once we start opening up this concept, then we start having a critical look at the state of American democracy. And then when we pan out further, country after country, which is nominally democratic, has a terrible history of violence. Even in Britain, we've had recently, in the last few years, we've had 2 MPs being killed, one by a Nazi, one by an Islamist. And if you then look in Europe, of course, even though there's been relative calm on the violence front in politics since 1945, nobody can forget that in the 20th century, we had a massive world war and the entire Second World War. So violence, we're dripping with blood in terms of history. And if you see it from that perspective, then stable, democratic, liberal politics is the exception. It's not a normal state. It's not a steady state. It's something which actually happens in times where there is growing prosperity, or the sense of growing prosperity, the sense that everybody has a stake in society. So if you take the post-war recovery in Europe and America after 45, and the sense of expanding prosperity and the prospects of jobs and houses and access to technology and access to televisions and cars, etc., there was a sort of period where the norm seemed to be one of gradual, even dramatic progress. But now, all over Europe and all over the world, that period now seems like a sort of blissful, illusory state. Take the euphoria in the late 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. We now look back and realize that we, the West, was misreading what was actually going on there in terms of the end of autocracy and totalitarian societies. And actually, something like the end of history was extremely naive about what this meant for the triumph of democracy. And the triumphalism of the 90s now looks extremely naive. So in that situation, where you do have a country which still seems relatively stable and democratic, etc., it no longer looks like a norm. It looks like an oasis in a rather stormy sea.
We're seeing a crisis of legitimacy of the state. So when we were preparing to talk, you emailed me some thoughts about, in our modern world, we take it for granted, or we have made a choice that the state must monopolize violence, as you put it, within established moral limitations to defend law and order from individual violence exercised for personal motives, or as part of a socio-political movement, or against enemies bent on destroying society from without. For instance, if we're attacked by another country, we expect our government, the state, to have an army to defend us. But we're seeing a crisis of legitimacy of the state today. The Weimar Republic comes up a lot. You know how I feel about some of these comparisons. I know how you feel. But, I mean, these are still useful in some ways. From 1930 on, people in and outside government were trying to destroy the Weimar Republic because it was no longer, in their eyes, up to the task of facing the economic and political crisis in the country. Today, in the United States, year 2024, the economy is pretty strong. We're safe, relatively safe from foreign invasion here. The United States still a hegemonic power. Yet, the essence of at least the Trump movement is that the state is failing us and is illegitimate.
Well, and there we have it, because if in the next 20 years the bubble of prosperity goes, if some of the predictions of economists about resources, about the global impact of the weather crisis on crops, on sheer possibility of developed nations feeding themselves, if some of the scenarios of mass migration from countries which are economically or politically or both unstable, both from Africa and Latin America and Mexico, if you start running things forward, you do quite quickly get to scenarios which are reminiscent of some post-apocalyptic Hollywood movies, where we're actually very, very fragile. I mean, I think what's at stake is the sense that I think what's happened is that millions of people, including myself, find it very difficult to have any stable sense of progress or way out or scenario which a benign scenario out of all this.
Yeah, I want to ask you, how does a society escape this type of cycle of recrimination, violence, finger-pointing? It seems hard to get out of it.
I'm very split about questions like that because there's still quite a solid number. I mean, it used to be called stupid things like the silent majority. Well, I'm part of a different sort of silent majority, not because I'm part of the majority that approves of insane, psychotic wars like the Vietnamese War, but because I still represent millions of ordinary, educated people, productive, creative, I hope, fairly sort of unviolent in our private lives, not excessively rich or consumerist or whatever, who actually still believe in fundamental values of global humanity, the possibility of improving lifestyles and the fate of the impoverished and the persecuted, etc., and that there is still a future for liberal democracy. People like Trump or Putin, etc., these are threats to liberal democracy, but they can be overcome or outlasted, or the Putin war can finish. Orban won't be there indefinitely. People will start seeing through Modi. Turkey will go democratic, because ultimately this is the great liberal hope. And the classic example, of course, is both on the one level, Hitler, who was defeated in 1945. It was unsustainable. You can't have a total global war when you're fighting it just with one country, or even a whole system like the Soviet Union. Eventually these go. This is why the rise of populism and the rise of Putin's Russia has come as such a great surprise for so many people, because many people felt that the liberal project of liberal progress was still on track. Sometimes I still think it is. Sometimes I can see all these terrible threats to democracy and temporary aberrations in an overall upward path. But sometimes I actually think maybe I'm deluding myself. Maybe the forces of conspiracy theory and Manichaeanism and extremism and frustrated nationalism and frustrated religious extremism and xenophobia and all. Maybe I'm deluding myself. Maybe because I've got my little bubble of a lifestyle, I'm misreading the degree to which I am out of step with the main force in history at present. And I feel very much on the cusp, like a barometer, going up and down with the latest piece of news, in my optimism about the fact that we can ride out all these blows against liberal democracy. And we might even get to a sustainable world society ecologically and politically. And that even places like China could democratize themselves fairly quickly, because even in China, there are literally millions of Chinese who actually are highly literate, educated, historically wise human beings. The more you impose these regimes, the more you build up a silent, repressed minority who could be there for when the regime collapses. So I oscillate between extreme pessimism and still a sort of guarded optimism. And the event happening with Trump and the fact that I'm pretty well resigned myself to the fact that he is probably going to win in the next elections, I don't see a breakdown of American society and mass violence, et cetera, I see a very sobering time in the next Trumpian administration. But given the history of America, I see that swinging back with a younger democratic force back into the rails of liberal democracy, pro-Europe, anti-Putin if he's still there, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that we need the long view. I don't think America's going to collapse into some violent maelstrom. I think it takes far more than even a couple of assassinations. You rode out your assassinations in the past. But I think much more dangerous, the gradual deliberalization of liberal democracy and the increasing tendency of non-liberal democracies to become isolated within themselves and within their own system in a way that precludes any real global society coming together.
That's right, because we're seeing a hollowing out.
Where I feel we are.
Yeah, a hollowing out of democracies.
A hollowing out.
And a turning away from otherness, right? So a hostility to migrants who will suffer as a consequence if they can't find places that are welcoming to them. You know, I feel the same way as you do. I bounce back and forth on this. Part of me says, things, at least in some parts of my country, have never been better. Would anyone trade today for the 1970s? You want to go back to that? However, I'm speaking as a middle-class white male in the United States, right? African-American experience has been much different than mine. There are many people in the Midwest, working-class white people, who are angry or feeling alienated or left behind, and we have to take that seriously because even though manufacturing has made a pretty strong comeback recently, there is a sense the fabric of their communities has been shredded by globalization. And we have opioids, and we have 2 forever wars in Iraq and Afghanistan that failed. And then the subprime mortgage crisis and a number of other pieces of institutional failure. I mean, this is serious. This is real. It's not invented.
I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on Biden to resign. He might go. He might be replaced by a younger Democrat. He'll probably get wiped out by the next election. But I think Trump is critical in all this because either he becomes more and more megalomaniac and more extreme, or once he's secure in his power for at least one term, he might do what a lot of extremist leaders do when they're within a democratic system. Pure pragmatism tames them. For example, it's very unlikely that he'll get rid of NATO. It's unlikely that he can do anything radical about the immigrant pressures on America. I think in terms of certain segments of American society, and here we talk about non-physical violence, but it's still violence against them. I think women, if I was an American young woman, I would feel that a period of Trump might not be one of physical violence towards me, but it would be violence against my rights. And I think that there are aspects of Republican policy which are forms of social violence personally. But I think there is far more pluralism and breadth of opinions and, in a way, far more genuine humanistic experience in America than can be wiped out by an administration or a few extremists in a party. When I see a Trumpian rally, when I see a Hitler rally in history, I know that meanwhile the SA were out there bashing heads, putting people in concentration. I mean, there was an entire system going on under Hitler, which was turning it into a massive, great big concentration camp. That is not true of American politics. This is one of the reasons why I get irritated by him being called a fascist or like Hitler or whatever, because civil society is still not under threat. Bits of it are, but in general, it is still a liberal democracy, or at least a democracy to the extent that no Barack Obama or Biden or Trump has the personal power, the autocratic power, to close down civil society and create a parastate, a two-tier legal system and a secret police and a Gestapo and start actually hauling off certain categories of people to concentration camps and torture. So I think we need a sense of historical perspective here. Things are bad, but honestly, they could be terrifyingly worse. And I still have a deep sense of optimism about human nature and, in a way, about American institutions. I think American democracy, in its humanistic sense, is far more resilient than it would seem if you just looked at day-to-day American politics.
And most people don't think about politics every day the way we do. What we're discussing here, most people would just prefer not to even have to think about their political leaders all the time. They just want to go about their lives. So, final thing, Roger Griffin, we'll wrap up on this. You just mentioned late Weimar and the rise of Nazism. I was stunned when I first read about reading Ian Kershaw, Richard Evans' books about the rise of the Third Reich, how in the Nazi paramilitaries, the brown shirts, the SA, you would find people who used to be on the left, communists, social democrats, or just people who were apolitical. They joined in because they had a chance to go out and crack someone's head open on the street. The sense of camaraderie, the sense of being part of a movement that was bigger than yourself, it was empowering. The Treaty of Versailles, all the shame. And now you have this group of people that is making you feel great again, right? Or saying, you know what, you can go out and beat your opponent's head in and get away with it. It's much more exhilarating than voting for some lousy parliamentarian. You get my point here. What is it about human nature that leads people to feel that way? Because I do get concerned, even in my own country, when the taboo against violence is broken and people seek it out to enhance their human experience.
Well, I wouldn't like to speculate about human nature. I could put it in evolutionary terms. I mean, human beings, if you think of how they evolved into a world dominated by creatures with no shelter, with no technology, etc., we have, as part of our evolutionary toolkit, the ability to kill, to slaughter, to trap animals, to cook flesh to eat, and to ward off, protect our communal resources from attack from animals and from fellow human beings. This is part of our equipment for survival. And when a society collapses in a way which is absolutely incomparable to the state of America today, a massive defeat millions of people who'd been fighting in a war that they lost, a collapse of the economy, change of regime imposed by foreigners, a total collapse a second time after the Wall Street crash, etc. There was a massive sense of loss of Germany, a loss of identity, sense of existential threat. Now, if you had the equivalent to that in America today, I have no doubt that you would quickly get into the scenario that you get, for example, in the terrifying book, The Turner Diaries, by William Turner, who envisages a sort of Armageddon of racist Americans against the decadent society they're living in. But actually, if you look at America today, it's nowhere near Weimar in terms of the degree of existential crisis, the sheer number of human beings who've lost all sense of purpose in life, who have lost their sense of identity, their Americanness. They haven't got that degree of even material impoverishment and hunger that is anything comparable to what happened in Weimar after 1928, for example. So this is where analogies are false. And that actually, if that total collapse of society happened in America, I have no doubt there would be massive violence. You've certainly got the citizens' ownership of guns and machine guns to fuel a massive, great sort of Armageddon. But I think that America is incomparably more stable in terms of human values than anything that happened in Weimar. And I would also maybe this sounds like a facetious remark, but the fact that so many millions of Americans are living in virtual reality, that they are literally force-feeding themselves on screens, on podcasts, on TV programs, on streaming, etc. Paradoxically, no matter how political it can look, it actually depoliticizes society and deactivates millions of people who would be very, very dangerous if they were out on the streets, like they were in fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and Soviet Russia. So in a way, one of the impacts of social media and the computer and the iPhone is actually to take a huge amount of energy out of real violent politics and into people's heads. So it's turned millions of people into sort of armchair watchers in the Colosseum while the battle is going on in the middle of the arena. So it's a vicarious violence for most people. One way or another, we just have to see the Trump-Biden and the next few years of American politics as a very sticky phase of American history, but not one which is inaugurating some colossal great collapse into some sort of apocalyptic scenario.
You know, with a crisis, there is an opportunity for renewal on the part of each major political party. Maybe we could have somebody under the age of 70 run for president. You know, you're eligible now, Roger Griffin. You've reached the age where you can.
Well, I wouldn't be able to run for president. I'd be able to hobble with arthritic knees towards power. But I do think that you may see a benign scenario after this attempted assassination, and you might actually have a genuine sense spreading across America that the Capitol riots and what just happened last week was something to stand back from, that this was an edge of a cliff that people do not want to fall over.
On the next episode of History as It Happens. They haven't gotten too much attention over the past week, but there are still calls inside the Democratic Party for President Joe Biden to step aside, withdraw from the race, and possibly have an open convention in Chicago in August. Open conventions used to be the norm. We'll go over that fascinating history with historian Michael Kazin next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.